Everything you are about to hear is completely real and based on true historical events that unfolded during the Second World War. The images and videos shown throughout this documentary are generated using artificial intelligence only for illustrative purposes, to help visualize these actual events. What follows is the true story of the Battle of Midway, a naval engagement that lasted 3 days but was decided in 4 miraculous minutes. A battle that shifted the balance of power in the Pacific and proved that courage, intelligence, and chance can converge to change the course of history. In the crystalline waters of the Central Pacific, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks crowded with planes being armed and fueled for a second strike against Midway Island. It was shortly after 10 in the morning on June 4, 1942, and the Japanese combined fleet, the most powerful naval force in the world, appeared invincible. 6 months earlier, these same carriers had devastated the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. In the months that followed, they had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, conquering territory from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific. But in the next 4 minutes, everything would change. American dive bombers, arriving at the perfect moment through a combination of skill, determination, and extraordinary luck, would plunge from the sky and destroy 3 of those carriers. The 4th would follow hours later. When the sun set on June 4th, Japanese naval dominance in the Pacific was shattered, never to be restored. This is the story of how that miracle happened. The road to Midway began 6 months earlier in the horror and chaos of Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck the American naval base in Hawaii in a surprise attack that destroyed or damaged 18 ships, killed over 2,000 Americans, and brought the United States into World War II. The architect of that attack was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and one of the most brilliant naval strategists of his generation. Yamamoto had not wanted war with America. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and understood American industrial power better than most of his colleagues. He had opposed Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany and warned his government that war with the United States would be catastrophic. "I shall run wild for the first 6 months," he reportedly told Prime Minister Kano, "but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." When his warnings were ignored and war became inevitable, Yamamoto designed the Pearl Harbor operation not because he believed Japan could win a long war, but because a devastating initial blow offered the only chance of forcing America to negotiate rather than fight to total victory. Pearl Harbor succeeded tactically but failed strategically. The attack destroyed battleships but missed the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea that day. More critically, it united American public opinion in a way nothing else could have. The isolationist sentiment that had kept America out of the war evaporated overnight. Roosevelt's declaration of war passed Congress with only 1 dissenting vote. Yamamoto's worst fears were realized. Japan now faced a aroused industrial giant with limitless resources and an absolute determination to achieve total victory. The 6 months Yamamoto had predicted he could run wild were ticking away. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces achieved victories beyond even optimistic expectations. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and vast stretches of the Pacific fell under Japanese control. The empire reached its maximum extent, controlling resources and territory that had been the objective of Japanese strategic planning for decades. But beneath the surface of these victories, problems were emerging. Japanese industry could not replace losses in ships and aircraft at the rate needed to sustain offensive operations. The carrier pilots who had trained for years before the war were irreplaceable. Everyone lost was a permanent degradation of Japanese fighting power. American industrial production, meanwhile, was accelerating. New ships, planes, and trained crews were entering service in increasing numbers. Time was not on Japan's side. Yamamoto understood this with painful clarity. He needed another decisive victory, one that would destroy what remained of American naval power in the Pacific and force a negotiated settlement before American production reached overwhelming levels. His target was the American carriers that had escaped Pearl Harbor. To bring them into a decisive battle, he needed bait, a target so valuable that the Americans would commit their carriers to defend it. That target was Midway Atoll, a tiny ring of sand and coral 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was strategically important as an advanced American base, but more importantly, it was close enough to Hawaii that its capture would threaten Pearl Harbor itself. Yamamoto believed the Americans would fight to hold Midway, and in that fight, he would destroy their carrier force and win the war. It was a sound plan based on logical assumptions. It would fail catastrophically because Yamamoto's most fundamental assumption was wrong. The Americans already knew he was coming. The story of how the Americans knew about the Midway operation is one of the great intelligence triumphs of World War II. At Pearl Harbor's Station Hypo, a basement facility dedicated to breaking Japanese naval codes, a team of cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort worked around the clock on Japanese communications. Rochefort was a brilliant, eccentric officer who lived in the basement bunker wearing a smoking jacket and slippers, sustaining himself on coffee and cigarettes as he pursued the patterns hidden in intercepted Japanese messages. By May 1942, his team had partially broken the Japanese JN-25 naval code and was reading fragments of Japanese operational communications. They knew a major operation was being planned, designated by the code letters AF. But what was AF? Rochefort believed it was Midway, but he needed proof. In one of the cleverest deceptions of the war, Rochefort had Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese communications intercepted and decoded mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The confirmation was absolute. AF was Midway, and the Japanese were coming in force. Rochefort estimated the attack would come in early June and would involve at least 4 carriers. His intelligence was precise, detailed, and absolutely critical. It gave Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, the one advantage that could offset Japanese superiority in numbers and experience: foreknowledge. Nimitz would know where and when the Japanese were coming, and he could position his forces to ambush them. It was the kind of advantage that comes once in a war if you're lucky. Nimitz intended to use it perfectly. The American Pacific Fleet in May 1942 was desperately weak. 2 carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, had just fought the Battle of the Coral Sea against a Japanese force moving to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea. Lexington had been sunk, and Yorktown was badly damaged. That left Nimitz with only 2 fully operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, to face what intelligence indicated would be 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. The math was terrible. Under normal circumstances, Nimitz should have conceded Midway and preserved his fleet. But these were not normal circumstances. He had Rochefort's intelligence. He knew where the Japanese would be and when. He could set a trap. And miraculously, Yorktown arrived at Pearl Harbor on May 27th, damaged but afloat. Shipyard workers estimated repairs would take 3 months. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Working around the clock, Hundreds of workers swarmed over the carrier, welding, patching, and jury-rigging repairs that would hold just long enough. On May 30th, Yorktown left Pearl Harbor, trailing oil and with unfinished repairs but operational enough to fight. Nimitz now had 3 carriers. It still wasn't enough for a conventional battle, but with surprise and luck, it might be sufficient for an ambush. Command of the American carrier force went to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, an experienced officer who had commanded at Coral Sea, and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser commander thrust into carrier operations when Admiral Halsey fell ill with shingles. Spruance was calm, methodical, and brilliant, a man who calculated probabilities and made decisions with cold logic. He would prove to be exactly the right man at exactly the right moment. Fletcher and Spruance took their carriers northeast of Midway and waited, hidden from Japanese reconnaissance, ready to strike when the opportunity came. Yamamoto's plan depended on achieving surprise. He didn't know that surprise was impossible because the Americans were already waiting for him. The Japanese force approaching Midway was overwhelming in size and power. Yamamoto brought 11 battleships, 4 large carriers, 2 light carriers, 16 cruisers, 45 destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. The invasion force alone numbered 15 transports carrying 5,000 troops. It was the most powerful naval armada Japan had ever assembled. But Yamamoto made a critical error in how he organized this massive force. He divided it into multiple groups separated by hundreds of miles, believing this complexity would confuse the Americans. Instead, it ensured that when battle came, Japanese forces could not support each other. The carrier striking force, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, operated independently, hundreds of miles ahead of Yamamoto's main body. When Nagumo's carriers came under attack, the battleships that might have screened them were too far away to help. Complexity, intended as strength, became fatal weakness. Nagumo was a surface warfare officer thrust into carrier command by the personnel needs of the expanding war. He was competent but lacked the innovative flexibility that carrier warfare demanded. More critically, he did not believe the Americans would be at Midway. Japanese intelligence had failed completely to detect the American carriers leaving Pearl Harbor. Nagumo expected to strike Midway, suppress its defenses, and support the invasion without serious opposition. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, carried between them over 200 aircraft and the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. On paper, even 3 American carriers should not have been able to seriously challenge this force. But war is not fought on paper, and Nagumo was about to learn that the most important factor in battle is often not the forces you have but the information you possess and the decisions you make in critical moments. The Battle of Midway began before dawn on June 4th, when Nagumo launched over 100 aircraft to attack Midway's airbase and defenses. The strike was devastating. Midway-based aircraft made desperate attacks on the Japanese carriers, but achieved nothing except their own destruction. Marine pilots in obsolete aircraft flew into wall of anti-aircraft fire and were shot down by the scores. Torpedo bombers attacked without fighter escort and were massacred. By mid-morning, Midway's air power was effectively destroyed, but it had accomplished something critical. It had forced Nagumo to make a decision. The strike leader reported that Midway needed another attack to fully suppress its defenses. At the same time, Nagumo's carriers were recovering the first strike and had a second wave of aircraft spotted on deck, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships. If American carriers appeared, this second wave would attack them. But Nagumo didn't believe American carriers were anywhere near Midway. He ordered the second wave rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. It was a logical decision based on the information he had. it was also a decision that would doom his carriers. Rearming aircraft on a carrier deck is complex, dangerous, and time-consuming. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs had to be removed and struck below. Land attack bombs had to be brought up and loaded. Aviation fuel lines had to be purged and refilled. It created a period of maximum vulnerability when the carriers were cluttered with munitions, fuel, and aircraft in various states of readiness. And it was at this precise moment that Nagumo received the message he had dreaded. A Japanese reconnaissance plane, launched late due to mechanical problems, reported American ships to the northeast. Nagumo demanded clarification. What type of ships? The scout could not tell. Nagumo hesitated, caught between two imperatives. Should he continue preparing for the second Midway strike or reverse course and prepare for a carrier battle? Then came the message that changed everything. The American force included carriers. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming stopped and the aircraft prepared with anti-ship weapons again. The flight decks dissolved into chaos as armament crews worked frantically to reverse the previous order. Bombs were removed and restacked. Torpedoes were brought back up from below. All of this took time, and time was the one resource Nagumo no longer had. The American carriers, northeast of Midway, had launched their strike as soon as they received word of the Japanese position. Every available aircraft took off. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. The plan was for all three types to attack simultaneously, the fighters suppressing defensive fighters, the torpedo bombers attacking from low altitude to force the Japanese to maneuver, and the dive bombers striking from high altitude while the defenses were focused low. It was textbook carrier doctrine, but executing it required precise timing and coordination. The American strike groups, launched from 3 different carriers, failed to coordinate. They arrived over the Japanese fleet piecemeal at different times from different directions. The torpedo bombers arrived first without fighter escort and were slaughtered. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was wiped out entirely. 15 aircraft and 30 crew members died in a matter of minutes, achieving not a single hit. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown lost 10 of 12. American torpedo bombers died by the dozens, shot down by Japanese fighters, or destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, their obsolete torpedoes ineffective even in the rare cases when they reached their targets. It was a massacre, seemingly confirming Japanese superiority and American inadequacy. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons accomplished something their crews would never know. They drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, where the fighters pursued and destroyed the slow-moving bombers. The Japanese carriers maneuvered violently to avoid torpedoes, breaking formation. And critically, Japanese attention was focused downward on the torpedo attack when the American dive bombers finally arrived high above. At approximately 10:25 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, found the Japanese fleet. He had gambled on a course change, extending his search beyond the planned return point, gambling that his calculations of Japanese movements were correct. He was nearly out of fuel when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the fleet. Following that wake, he found the carriers. At the same moment, Yorktown's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, approached from a different angle. 2 American dive bomber squadrons, totaling about 50 aircraft, arrived simultaneously over 3 Japanese carriers whose defenses were completely focused on the torpedo attacks still in progress. What happened next took 4 minutes and changed the war. McCluskey split his squadrons, sending some to attack Kaga while he led others against Akagi. Leslie's Yorktown bombers attacked Soryu. The dive bombers rolled into their dives, plunging down through 3 miles of air at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Japanese lookouts screamed warnings, but it was too late. The first bomb struck Akagi near the midship elevator. It penetrated to the hangar deck, where aircraft were being rearmed. The explosion detonated aviation fuel and munitions. Within seconds, Akagi's hangar was a raging inferno. More bombs hit. The fire spread beyond control. Nagumo was forced to abandon his flagship, transferring his flag to a cruiser while Akagi burned. On Kaga, bombs struck in rapid succession, 4 direct hits that turned the carrier into a blazing wreck. Aviation fuel and ordnance exploded continuously. The fires couldn't be contained. On Soryu, 3 bombs hit within 2 minutes. The pattern was the same: penetration to the hangar deck, secondary explosions, uncontrollable fires. By 10:30, 4 minutes after the attack began, 3 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks, their crews fighting desperately to save their ships, but already facing a hopeless situation. The most experienced carrier division in the world had been destroyed in the time it takes to soft-boil an egg. The 4th carrier, Huryu, had been separated from the others by the evasive maneuvers taken during the torpedo attacks. She escaped the initial American dive bomber strike. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, immediately launched a counterstrike against the American carriers. Japanese aircraft attacked Yorktown, already damaged from Coral Sea and now hit by bombs and a torpedo that stopped her dead in the water. American damage control worked miracles, getting the carrier underway again, but a second Japanese strike from Huryu put 2 more torpedoes into Yorktown. This time the damage was fatal. The order to abandon ship was given. Yorktown would linger for days before finally sinking, but she was effectively out of the battle. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Huryu might salvage something from the disaster. Then American scout planes located her. Enterprise launched a strike that found Huryu in late afternoon. Dive bombers put 4 bombs into the carrier. Like her sisters, she was soon a burning wreck. Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship. By sunset on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were sinking or sunk. Japanese naval aviation had been gutted. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster throughout the day, initially ordered his battleships forward, hoping to bring the Americans into a surface engagement where Japanese superiority in heavy guns might redeem the situation. But Spruance, thinking clearly despite the chaos and tension, refused the bait. He withdrew his carriers eastward during the night, unwilling to risk a night surface action against superior Japanese forces. It was the right decision. Without their carriers, the Japanese had no way to strike American forces beyond gun range. The battle was effectively over. Yamamoto, facing reality, ordered a general withdrawal. The invasion of Midway was abandoned. The combined fleet retreated westward, leaving behind 4 carriers, a heavy cruiser, over 3,000 dead sailors, and Japanese hopes of winning the Pacific War. The American victory at Midway was decisive but not cheap. Yorktown was lost along with a destroyer. Over 300 American aircraft were destroyed or damaged. Over 300 Americans died, most of them the torpedo bomber crews who attacked without hope of success to create the conditions for the dive bombers' triumph. These men were not fools or fanatics. They were professionals who understood their duty and performed it knowing the likely cost. Their sacrifice bought 4 minutes of opportunity that changed history. Their names deserve to be remembered. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, who floated in the water watching the battle unfold around him. John Waldron, who led his squadron to death with the words, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." Yen's Agent Osmus from Yorktown, shot down during the dive bomber attack, captured by the Japanese and later executed. These men and hundreds like them gave everything they had so that 4 minutes of perfect execution could destroy Japanese naval power. Their courage was not wasted. The strategic consequences of Midway reverberated throughout the remainder of the war. Japan never again mounted a major offensive operation. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air crews was a blow from which the Japanese Navy never recovered. Plans to capture New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, operations that would have cut the supply line between America and Australia, were abandoned. The initiative passed permanently to the United States. 2 months after Midway, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, beginning the long, bloody campaign up the Solomon Islands chain. The Americans would lose more ships at Guadalcanal than at Midway, but they could afford the losses. Japanese losses were irreplaceable. With each battle, American numerical and material superiority increased. By 1943, American industrial production was delivering carriers, aircraft, and trained crews in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. The road from Midway led inexorably to Tokyo Bay and Japanese surrender. For Admiral Yamamoto, Midway was the confirmation of his darkest predictions. He had warned that he could run wild for 6 months. The 6 months were up. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. From that point forward, Japan was fighting a defensive war it could not win. Yamamoto continued to command the combined fleet, trying to husband his depleting resources and find opportunities for the decisive battle that might still force a negotiated peace. But the opportunity never came. In April 1943, American codebreakers decrypted Japanese communications, revealing Yamamoto's travel schedule for an inspection tour. Admiral Nimitz authorized a mission to intercept and shoot down Yamamoto's aircraft. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters ambushed Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville and shot it down, killing the admiral. Japan lost its most capable naval strategist and the man who had designed both Pearl Harbor and Midway. His death was another blow to a nation that could ill afford any more losses. The Battle of Midway has been studied exhaustively by military historians, strategists, and anyone interested in how battles are won and lost. The lessons are numerous and sometimes contradictory. Intelligence was critical. Rochefort's codebreakers gave Nimitz the foreknowledge needed to position his forces for an ambush. Without that intelligence, the Americans would not have been at Midway in force, and the Japanese invasion might well have succeeded. But intelligence alone did not win the battle. Execution mattered. American pilots flying obsolete aircraft and using tactics that proved suicidal for torpedo bombers kept attacking until they created the opportunity for the dive bombers to strike. Timing mattered. The 4-minute window when American dive bombers arrived simultaneously over multiple Japanese carriers with their defenses focused elsewhere was the product of failed coordination that accidentally created perfect coordination. Chance mattered. McCluskey's decision to search beyond his planned turnaround point, following a hunch and a destroyer's wake, put him over the Japanese fleet at exactly the right moment. Remove any one of these factors and the battle might have turned out differently. Japanese mistakes also contributed critically to their defeat. Nagumo's decision to rearm his strike aircraft for a second attack on Midway left his carriers vulnerable at the critical moment. His failure to launch adequate reconnaissance meant he didn't know American carriers were present until too late. Yamamoto's decision to divide his forces meant that superior Japanese numbers couldn't be brought to bear when and where they were needed. Japanese overconfidence, born of 6 months of unbroken victories, led them to underestimate American capabilities and determination. The Japanese believed, perhaps justifiably based on recent experience, that American pilots and crews were inferior to Japanese forces. The torpedo bomber attacks seemed to confirm this prejudice. Then the dive bombers arrived and shattered that illusion permanently. The human dimension of Midway is what makes the battle enduringly compelling. These were not machines or abstractions fighting. They were young men, most in their 20s, thrust into situations of unimaginable stress and danger. Japanese pilots who had trained for years before the war, who considered themselves the elite of naval aviation, found themselves swimming in burning oil as their carriers sank beneath them. American pilots who had trained for months, who in many cases had never seen combat before June 4th, found themselves pressed into desperate attacks against superior forces. Some rose to the occasion with acts of extraordinary courage and skill. Others broke under the strain, and no one who wasn't there can judge them. The vast majority simply did their jobs as best they could under impossible circumstances. That, in the end, is what won the battle. Thousands of individuals doing their jobs, making countless small decisions, enduring fear and exhaustion, supporting each other, adapting when plans failed, and refusing to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. The memory of Midway has been shaped and reshaped over the decades since 1942. Immediately after the battle, American propaganda emphasized the complete nature of the victory while downplaying the costs and the role of luck. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons was portrayed as heroic rather than as the result of inadequate aircraft and tactics. Japanese accounts, when they finally emerged after the war, emphasized bad luck and the overwhelming material superiority of American forces, downplaying the role of poor decisions and intelligence failures. The truth, as always, is more complex. Midway was won by a combination of intelligence, courage, sacrifice, good decisions, bad decisions by the enemy, and luck. Trying to identify a single decisive factor misses the reality that battles are decided by countless factors, converging in ways that can rarely be predicted or controlled. As the veterans of Midway aged and began passing away, efforts intensified to record their memories and preserve their stories. The last survivors of Torpedo Squadron 8, the few who hadn't flown that day, became sought-after speakers, telling the story of their comrades' sacrifice. Dive bomber pilots who had rolled into their dives over the Japanese carriers described the surreal experience of plunging through empty sky toward a target that wasn't shooting back because its attention was focused elsewhere. Japanese survivors, fewer in number and often reluctant to speak, gradually shared their memories of the catastrophic minutes when their world was destroyed. These testimonies reveal the battle as the participants experienced it, confused, terrifying, and shaped as much by accident and circumstance as by planning and skill. The physical site of the Battle of Midway remains largely undisturbed. The carriers rest on the ocean floor in water too deep for casual divers. The wrecks of Yorktown, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Huryu have been located by deep-sea exploration missions and documented with underwater photography. They are war graves, protected by international convention and respect. The aircraft that still lie on the ocean floor, the remains of the men who were never recovered. These are the tangible remnants of 3 days in June when the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance and was decided in favor of the United States not by material superiority, though that would come, but by better intelligence, better decisions, and 4 minutes of perfect execution. The legacy of Midway extends beyond its immediate impact on the Pacific War. The battle demonstrated the primacy of aircraft carriers in naval warfare, confirming a revolution that had been emerging since the British torpedo bomber attack on Taranto in 1940 and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Battleships, the capital ships of navies for centuries, were decisively rendered obsolete. The war would be fought and won by carriers, submarines, and the aircraft they carried. Midway also validated the importance of intelligence in modern warfare. Rochefort's codebreakers proved that information could be as valuable as ships or planes. The ability to read enemy communications, to know their plans and intentions, gave the Americans an advantage that offset Japanese numerical superiority at the critical moment. These lessons shaped American naval and intelligence doctrine for decades, influencing strategy during the Cold War and beyond. For individual participants, Midway was often the defining experience of their lives. The battle lasted 3 days, but its memory lasted lifetimes. Some veterans spoke of it often, finding meaning and pride in their service. Others rarely mentioned it, carrying their memories privately. Some struggled with survivors' guilt, asking why they lived when so many friends and comrades died. Others found peace in the belief that their sacrifice and survival had meaning, that they had contributed to something larger than themselves. The diversity of responses reminds us that there is no single veteran experience, no single way to process the trauma and triumph of combat. What united them was the knowledge that they had participated in something historically significant, a battle that would be studied and remembered as long as people studied war. The story of Midway is ultimately a story about human beings under extreme stress making decisions with incomplete information and then living with the consequences. Yamamoto made decisions based on assumptions that proved false. Nagumo made decisions that seemed logical at the moment but proved fatal in retrospect. Nimitz made decisions based on intelligence that proved accurate. Spruance made decisions that proved prescient. McCluskey made a decision to keep searching that put him over the Japanese fleet at the decisive moment. Each decision was made by a person doing their best to interpret a chaotic situation and choose the right course of action. That some succeeded and others failed owed something to skill and judgment, but also something to luck and circumstances beyond any individual's control. Understanding this doesn't diminish the achievement of those who won or excuse the failures of those who lost. It simply acknowledges the reality that war is irreducibly complex, and its outcomes are never inevitable until they happen. If this journey through one of the most consequential naval battles in history has deepened your understanding of how intelligence, courage, and chance converged to change the course of the Pacific War, then I invite you to continue exploring with us. Here at WW2 War Rewind, we are committed to bringing you meticulously researched, deeply immersive documentaries that illuminate the real events, real decisions, and real people who shaped World War II. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss another deep exploration of the battles and campaigns that define the 20th century's greatest conflict. We release new content regularly, each documentary crafted with the same dedication to historical accuracy and compelling storytelling you've just experienced. Join our growing community of history enthusiasts by hitting that subscribe button now, and let's continue this journey through history together. Thank you for spending this time with WW2 War Rewind, where we believe that understanding how history unfolded is essential to understanding the world we live in today.